We are really honored to be hosting Miles Harvey, author of The King of Confidence, which has gotten raves from the New York Times, from Dave Eggers, and many more. He, as I mentioned, he teaches at DePaul University, and is the author of The Island of Lost Maps. And I bet he did an event at Boswell. In fact, I know you did an event at Boswell because I remember buying the books for it. But now I'm the marketing person with Chris, so you're talking to me. What a super book for folks who like Erik Larson. Also has a wonderful quote from Nathaniel Philbrick, who's done a few events with us. And it's the perfect also recommendation for those folks because, like all of Nathaniel Philbrick's books, it's got a lot of water in it. So anyway, welcome, Miles Harvey. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. Glad to be here.
We always love to have folks start out by talking a little about your book. So why don't you introduce, for folks who wandered into this blindly, tell them a little about The King of Confidence.
Well, maybe I'll start with a little, this is partly a Wisconsin book and even partly a Milwaukee book, but I thought I might start at the beginning of the story. All right, so this is a guy I wrote about. His name is James Jesse Strang. He was born in 1813 and he grew up in Western New York. And he was pretty much a failure at everything he did there. He was a country lawyer and a newspaper man and a postmaster. The one thing he was good at was sort of taking people's money, but that did not endear him to some of his fellow New Yorkers, and he was run out of town. According to one report, he faked his own death. So he could start anew, and so he went west. And in 1843, west meant Wisconsin. The name Midwest did not exist and wouldn't for like another 50 years. After paying a visit to Nauvoo, Illinois, which was in the capital of the Mormon culture. It was as big as Chicago, or possibly bigger. It was an amazing city, international city, people from all over the world, but especially from England and the United States there. Strang, who had been an atheist his whole life, suddenly converted to Mormonism. In 1844, the founder and prophet of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, was shot and killed. And shortly thereafter, Strang started to claim that Smith had handed over the church to him. This would be like handing over the Pentagon to a private in the army. He had just joined the church. He was not a figure of any kind of stature, but he produced this letter supposedly from Smith. We now think it's a forgery, saying, the church is yours, I need you to do it. But even then, people didn't buy into it in the Mormon church. They were like a little suspicious. So Strang had to come up with more miracles. He had by then settled in Burlington, Wisconsin, which we have at least one viewer who is from Burlington, but many of you know is about 40 miles southwest of Milwaukee. And so he needed another miracle. And so I'm going to read a paragraph or two about that other miracle. On September 13, 1845, fledgling prophet James Jesse Strang gathered a group of his closest followers to report that, quote, it had been revealed to him in a vision that an account of an ancient people were buried in a hill south of the White River Bridge in Burlington. After leading the men up that rise to an oak tree, he instructed them to examine the ground carefully for signs of tampering. According to the digger's subsequent sworn testimony, quote, the tree was surrounded by a sward of deeply rooted grass, and upon the most critical examination, we could not discover any indication that it had ever been cut through or disturbed. Now, as Jame Strang stood aside, the men dug to a depth of about 3 feet, eventually setting aside their spades and hacking away at hard-packed clay with a pickaxe, until suddenly they struck something, a flat stone about 1 foot wide and 3 inches thick, which they pried from the soil. Underneath it, they discovered a case of slightly baked clay containing 3 plates of brass, covered with various symbols, including a man with a crown on his head and a scepter in his hand, along with, quote, what appeared to be alphabetic characters, but in a language of which we have no knowledge. That language would also prove to be unknown to scholars. In fact, only one man in the world possessed the power to translate it. Luckily, he happened to be the same person who had seen the vision and brought the men to the hillside near the White River that day. James Jesse Strang took the brass plates into his hand and headed back down the hill to begin deciphering the mysterious script. You can see the script, and we could take a quiz of Zoom land there, and I bet you would probably vote that this mysterious script proved miraculously that James Jesse Strang was indeed the true inheritor of the Mormon Church. And so that's how he got started. And eventually his kingdom, because he gathered many, many people, he gathered hundreds of people, moved north from Burlington to Beaver Island in northernmost Lake Michigan, where he declared himself king of heaven and earth, and set up a pirate colony and antagonized a US president, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. Thank you. Daniel, I can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
I am just in awe, so I didn't start yet. I was trying to decode that, because I don't think I saw the tablet. I don't know if it's in the book or not, but I think the galley might not have had plate.
Well, that's not actually the brass plates. That's a drawing of the brass plates, which have since disappeared, but were around for much of Strang's existence as king. He would take them out and show them to people. Some of his friends later declared that they were made out of a kettle, and that the whole thing was a scam from the start. But
I don't believe that. I'm a believer.
Well, I just believe that Strang's miracles were between him and God. But I will say that they often showed up, his revelations and miracles, at times when he needed a revelation or miracle.
You know, but what revelator doesn't have that happen? So, little Hebrew, I saw a couple of kind of Hebrew, a little Russian, a little. Can you talk a little about, since we're talking about Strang's miracles, can you put this in the context of the 1850s and
yes,
what was going on then?
So this was a really unstable period in American history. Like, it's a time, and I think we have those times in history, and I think we're going through one of those times in history where truth is just porous, right? There had been an economic crash, the greatest economic failure since or before the Great Depression. There were incredible technological changes, the photograph, the telegraph, the railroad. There was a communications revolution that was really comparable to the information age. I mean, it was a really a fundamental revolution, and in the volume, the speed of the way we exchanged information. And Strang was very shrewd about that. And of course, it was an absolutely tumultuous time, politically, socially, and in terms of religion. This was the antebellum period, which was the lead up to the Civil War. The truth was malleable. People like Strang, who conveyed confidence, which is where the word comes from in my book, were able to take advantage of this time by creating their own truths. And so he was fairly successful in doing that. He wasn't the only person. This is the time when we get the word confidence man. We know exactly when that word starts, 1849. A guy is caught on the streets of New York pulling a scam, and the word just spreads through American culture and the American lexicon with like really impressive speed. And the reason is because it describes so many people in all different ranks of society. It's also the great age of Phineas T. Barnum, who was, we think of him as a guy who ran a circus, but he, in his time, was this great hoaxer, kind of like public fraud, and kind of reveled in that. He would, he had a museum in New York. He would say, hey, I've got a mermaid on display. And, thousands of people would come see it. And some of them would say, that's not a mermaid. That's a monkey stitched to a fish. And he would say, well, maybe it is. Some people say it is. Some people say it isn't. And so this was an age when the truth was very much in question. And I think Strang was a person who was really adept at taking advantage of that.
One of the things you mentioned was that the Herman Melville book, The Confidence Man, actually came out sort of, I'm not sure if you made a definitive no, that it was maybe a little bit inspired by him.
So for people who haven't read that book, it's my favorite book by Herman Melville, and he wrote it or came out with it and was finishing it up in 1856, just as James Jesse Strang was being he'd been assassinated and as he was dying. And Melville mentions Mormons a fair amount in the book. It's sort of this shape-shifting confidence man. It's a really wonderful, weird, funny, and almost postmodern book. It's great. And a lot of scholars have thought that that's some reference to either Joseph Smith in Nauvoo or Brigham Young in Utah. But there's some stuff that doesn't make sense, including talking about like this northernmost outpost for these Mormons. And I went back and looked at the newspapers Melville was looking at, and he certainly was reading regularly about Strang as he worked on The Confidence Man. And so I'm not saying that absolutely the book was based on Strang's adventures, but this was something that was definitely on Melville's mind.
Would you also talk about the religious, I mean, I'm sure a lot of folks know, but as I said, I watched your event, a couple of your events, and I thought, oh gosh, these people know everything about everything. Well, I know nothing about nothing. This is where I'm coming from. And so could you talk about a little bit about the religious, this was just one of the many religious things going on.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So Strang grew up in a place called the Burned Over District during what we call the Second Great Awakening. And they called this part of Western New York, or much of Western New York, the Burned Over District. I love that name because it was just constantly being ripped up by religious fires, but also cultural fires and also political fires. There was just a blaze going through there. It was just a fevered time. So this is where Mormonism starts, but it's where a number of other religions, new religions at that time sort of get their ground, and also older religions are just burning hot. But it's also where a lot of cultural experiments are taking place, utopian colonies, et cetera, but also politically. This is, abolition doesn't start there, but it's totally a hot place for abolition. And the women's movement does sort of start there. And so you have all these fertile, crazy ideas. I mean, just nutty ideas with brilliant things that have changed culture. We celebrated John Lewis's life today. I mean, some of the abolitionists to come out of that period were every bit as committed. And interestingly, Strang was an abolitionist. I say in the book that he had one firm belief in anything. He was willing to change his beliefs to suit the needs of those listening to him, like many people who are successful at winning other people's trust. So for instance, he first ran as the anti-polygamy heir to the Mormon church. And then when it suited him, he ended up dying with 5 wives, so 4 of them pregnant. So, but abolition was, and African-American rights were one thing that seemed to be consistently an important thing to him. And
you to the point that he appointed a black priest, right?
Yeah, almost 130 years before the mainstream branch, sometimes called the Brighamite branch of the Mormon Church, did. Brigham Young, who was, for a while, Strang was his main rival for control of the church, was not a very progressive person in terms of race or slavery. And Strang was, and Strang acted consistently on his beliefs. Yeah, he ordained a Mormon elder, a guy who was himself very active, an African-American man who was very active in the abolition movement. And later, among his many weird parts of his career, Strang was elected to the Michigan legislature twice and voted consistently and advocated hard for African-American rights and against slavery. So that was one part of his life that is, it's just the only part of his life that's really consistent.
he quoted his good friend Fred Douglass. So
yeah, well, that's an interesting one of the things that I think I sort of dug up in this book of the new things I found out about Strang. So Strang was always like, I write that he was torn between idealism and opportunism. We have his diaries from his late teens and early 20s, and they're completely fascinating because on the one hand, there's all this sort of utopian thought, and on the other hand, he says, you know, I'm a secret atheist. No one knows that, and my Baptist family doesn't know that. But here's the thing, I'm really good at talking about religion, and when I talk about the Bible, people really perk up and they really listen to me. And I think early on, Strang just realized the power he had with this stuff. But what was your question again, Daniel?
I just mentioned the Fred Douglass.
Oh yeah, so we get into Fred Douglass. I knew I wanted to get around to that. So this idealism and this opportunism are clear in that Fred Douglass thing. Strang ran a newspaper, which he figured out ways of getting his stories out all over the country. But he was basically running a pirate colony on Beaver Island, where he would send out people to raid coastal towns on Lake Michigan, but also all over the Midwest to steal horses, which was a big business then, and to bring them back to Beaver Island. My book, I think, really kind of sort of shows more than previous books that Strang really was involved in a criminal enterprise. He claimed, and others have claimed since, there was anti-Mormon prejudice. There was a ton of anti-Mormon prejudice. The Mormons were a persecuted people, especially in the Midwest, but he was running a criminal enterprise. And I think that Fred Douglass quote is, so first of all, he calls him Fred Douglass. It's a book that Douglass had just published, one of a few autobiographies. And the interesting thing is what Strang excerpted. So what he excerpted was a passage from the autobiography about when it's okay to steal, saying, if you're a slave, if you're oppressed, it's okay to take things. And really, it's sort of your duty. And I think that shows Strang's idealism. I couldn't find any other newspaper in the country that excerpted that passage. But I also think it shows his just complete cynicism in that people of his group would have read that as justification for their own theft and their own plundering of other people.
Well, you talk a lot about consecration, which I wasn't too well versed in it, of this stealing in the name of your religion. You know, it was their creed. You know, that's what they did, or counterfeit or whatever. You know, and whatever you can do.
We should be clear that consecration can mean many things, and I'm certainly no expert on the Mormon Church, but it can mean like tithing. But in Strang's hands, consecration meant sort of forced tithing of other people. You will, you may not have expected us to show up in our boats in your little river town, but your general store is tithing to the Mormon Church today. And so that did not make him a lot of friends. And eventually, we can laugh about this stuff, but eventually the president of the United States, Millard Fillmore, took it seriously enough that he sent the Navy's first iron-hulled warship in to invade Beaver Island and bring it back to justice. And one of the many quirks of Strang's extraordinary life, and it's a tribute in part to his skills as a lawyer and as a propagandist, is that he and his followers were found innocent in a federal trial in Detroit. And so when Millard Fillmore left office in 1853 as like one of the loser presidents in US history, not a very interesting guy, and not even renominated by his own party, Strang was still king of Beaver Island.
Well, one of the fascinating things is this guy was the king of the island, but he was in the Michigan legislature. Like, how did?
So I think the way you have to think about Strang is as kind of a guy who is incredibly shrewd politically, and I mean, the U.S. government took his kingdom as enough of a threat to U.S. sovereignty that they invaded, right? And eventually, I don't want to spoil the ending, but it's in
No.
the title. He was killed by his own followers, probably with the help of the U.S. government and the state of Michigan. But yeah, I mean, he was both brilliant at using the system that was there. So it wasn't like, it was kind of Chicago style elections that got him elected. He really knew how to manipulate the system and get himself in office.
This guy did everything. Ballot box. I mean, like, he just, like, if you can think, I'm like, I think we have to move away from that abolitionism thing. Like, oh, what a guy. You know, if there was something he could do, it's pretty cynical. We have to talk a little about the polygamy, because the story of his second wife is just astounding, and also really captures something that was going on in the zeitgeist of that time. So
yeah,
could you tell him a little about Eliza?
Yeah, Elvira, yeah. So this is a guy named Charles J. Douglas, who was Strang's nephew and private secretary. And for many months, he traveled with Strang in 1849, just before, in 1850, just before Strang declared himself king of earth and heaven. And they were in a fundraising and recruiting campaign on the East Coast. And so he was in contact with hundreds and hundreds of people. And as you can see, Charles J. Douglas is a kind of, Charlie, as he was called, is a kind of handsome young man, dashing. Only he wasn't a young man. This was, in fact, a young woman named Elvira Field, who traveled in men's clothing with Strang for months, and Strang would introduce Elvira to everyone who met her as his nephew, who happened to sleep with the prophet. And men often shared beds then, so that wasn't an unusual thing in and of itself, except it was in fact his first plural wife, who he didn't want his actual first wife to know about. So this is his second wife. Eventually, Elvira took off the men's clothes and reappeared on Beaver Island, and eventually was sort of given legitimacy as his wife. And she is a fascinating person. One of the really interesting things about working on this book was the fascinating gender relations in the 1840s and 50s. And so what's shocking about this picture and about her is not that, because she didn't fool everybody, and Strang didn't fool everybody. There were a lot of people writing to each other saying that that is not a young man that he's traveling with, but that she fooled a lot of people. And part of that is that dress at the time for women was so, there was this cult of womanhood, and women wore just these outrageous number of petticoats, etc., to signify their womanhood. And people just couldn't deal with the idea of someone in men's clothing being a woman. And it may seem odd to us now, but at the time it was quite shocking. And it was really fascinating to study gender relations and to read authors like the great proto-feminist Margaret Fuller, who I hadn't read before. Shame on me for that, but what a joy and what an interesting thing. And what a woman ahead of her time. I mean, she talked about fluidity in gender the way we talk about it now. She said, no one is wholly man or wholly woman. We're all on a spectrum. And it was really interesting to read that from this time period.
Yeah, it is truly amazing how many parallels to today you find in this book. I mean, I think Christine Schultz asked me, and we're not doing questions yet, but she wanted to know about about the connections that you've seen to our current president. So you want to mention that?
Yeah, no, so so I didn't mention our current president or our current time in The King of Confidence.
Right. No.
I made an oblique reference at the beginning of the book, and the last line is a somewhat less oblique reference, but it's oblique. I don't name names, and I don't point to eras. On the other hand, there are many comparisons between that time and ours, and I think mostly I see them both as times where the truth becomes unstable and comes into question. Basic truths come into question, you know. And so the other thing about writing this book was my time working on it overlapped almost exactly with Trump's candidacy and election and presidency. And so, I'd go to sleep every night thinking about Trump and wake up every day thinking about Strang. And what I feel is like Trump helped me understand Strang, but Strang also helped me understand Trump, which I'm grateful for in certain ways, and also just a certain American attraction to the big lie, right? And so that was a really interesting part of the book. I think it would have been a fundamentally different book if I'd written it in a different time period.
Yeah. I think we had a question, and I was also interested in how you originally came across Strang, that's Sandy Rizzo, and also a little about what kind of you did so much research for this book, obviously, but talk a little about the process. And you also said that you really, while there has been things written about Strang before, that you actually uncovered things that people didn't know. So
yeah, so I first heard about Strang in Burlington. So I have a good, a brother-in-law and a good friend, Chris Carr, who grew up in Burlington. And maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, we were up visiting his parents and hanging around in town. And Chris and I went out, I don't know, on some errand. And he started driving me around and pointing to old buildings and telling me this unbelievable story about this utopian colony, 2 hours north of Chicago, and how the remnants of that colony had remained in Burlington, Strangites. There'd been some, and how Chris had grown up among some of the last members of this church. I mean, of course I was impressed with the story and curious about it, but then I didn't think much about it until I got a call or maybe an email from my agent one day and said, this was just luck, that an editor at Little Brown wants to talk to you and has a book idea he wants you to think about doing a proposal for. And, I was really happy to hear that, but I was pretty skeptical about whether it would work out. My friend Kevin Davis, fellow author and longtime fellow freelance writer, has this theory that no assignment is as good or as fun if you don't think of it. So I was a little skeptical, but then Ben George is the guy's name. He started talking about Strang, and instantly I was hooked. And Ben and I just had a great chemistry from the start. He's an old-fashioned Maxwell Perkins type editor, real hands-on, but in a good way. He really let me do my thing with the book, but also identified what that thing was and made sure it was as good as it can possibly be. So I was really grateful to work with him. And as far as research goes, I mean, I think I pushed Strang's story forward in some ways that are positive, and in a lot of ways that are not so positive. On the positive end, I think I contributed some information about why he was an abolitionist. As a young lawyer, Strang had to go and clean up some mess that his father-in-law, who was a very corrupt canal contractor, had left in Virginia. And when Strang got out there, working on this canal, he probably knew it before, but discovered that his father-in-law, like all the contractors or many of the contractors on this canal, was using slave labor, and that his father-in-law had just left these people in the most destitute condition. So he just saw the plight of African Americans pre-Civil War and in the horrors of slavery firsthand. And I think that left an impression on him. So that was one thing. Many things I found out about him also were not as complimentary. For instance, I said earlier that there's been a lot of debate about whether he was actually running a criminal enterprise. Well, I found, among other sort of proof of this, I found a story in Perrysburg, Ohio, this little town in Ohio, that unfolds in real time. So some of the critics have said before, well, these are told, you know, later, these stories, these are just myths. Well, this unfolds in real time. A horse thief comes to town, a posse goes out after him, he's brought back to town. He's one of Strang's very top assistants, kind of a muscle man, an enforcer who is well known among Strang's people. The editor of the local paper says, you know, this guy ain't gonna be in jail that long. And then Strang comes to town. And then the man is convicted, but the conviction is overturned on a technicality. And the local journalists are saying, well, that technicality was a bribe. The sheriff screwed this up. And there's just, it's all in real time. And then sure enough, the man escapes, miraculously escapes prison and shows up back on Beaver Island. So I think, among other things, I showed more than I think any other writer about Strang, because there's some very good books about Strang, that he was in fact running a criminal enterprise.
Oh, that whole, like, just the canal stuff was so interesting to me. Just that, you know, like, where they would figure out that these things wouldn't work, and they're like, well, let's just use the money anyway. It reminded me, you know, his father-in-law. That was another sort of.
Yeah, that was another. Yeah, that was another addition I made. Strang's father-in-law. No, we didn't know anything about him before. There was a writer, I actually, she jumped onto a forum I was at like this recently, who wrote a great book about Strang. Vicky Cleverly Speak is her name. And she had made the move forward that he was not a candle maker. She said that transcription is wrong. He was a canal contractor. And I just went with that. And I just found out the guy had left a real messy life. He'd been an Erie Canal contractor. He'd taken the money and run. This was a great source of graft, these big canal projects. He'd been arrested and sent to prison, which you would think would end his illustrious career as a canal contractor, but it did not at all. He was then went to Virginia, and I described the conditions. He worked there, and he also took the money and ran there. And then he went to Illinois and worked on the Illinois-Michigan Canal. And later worked on the railroads. And in fact, the last I tracked him, Abraham Lincoln was losing a case where Strang's father-in-law had been accused of stealing materials and soil from a farmer's land to build the railroad. And even Abraham Lincoln was not able to help him much.
Well, what do you want to bet that at least one of the COVID vaccine trials is going to be after I read this book, I'm like, there's no question that at least one of them is a complete and total scam, if not more. I also felt so contemporary reading about that. Somebody asked a little to transition, but not to transition. One of the things about that there's almost somebody, let's see, Ron, who I think just logged on, so I'm going to do his question, asked about America and why it is a fertile territory for cults. And of course, we're not really, you know, in this particular case, it was more of a religion, but I know there's always like, you know, in some ways a cult is a religion that doesn't have a you know, doesn't sort of stand up to history. What is your take on the United States in that? In terms of doing the research when you were, because you talk also about utopian communities and things like that. This, you know, I'm shutting up now.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is an exciting American impulse, and we're not obviously the only country that has this impulse, but towards reinvention. And so, for instance, you know, Mormonism is just this incredible sort of, whether or not you believe in the revelations of Joseph Smith, and I don't question anyone's faith, as sort of a literary event, the Book of Mormon is amazing that he first of all, or the book says, that the Bible is ongoing. It's not this thing from thousands of years ago. And it unfolds on North America. That must have been so seductive to people at that time. And there were all sorts of new religions popping up. And we now call some of them cults. We didn't have that name then, but this is when all these new religions are popping up. And I think part of it is this completely apocalyptic impulse, which was both good and bad in America at that time. People really believed the world was coming to an end. But I think it's also just this sort of American idea of reinvention. It also may have had something to do with an American, impulse towards the big lie. When Charles Dickens came here in 1842 into the Midwest, he was really struck by Americans' attraction to what he called smart men. So men who would rip you off and smile at you, and he would say, well, that guy just embezzled all this or took all this money from people. Why aren't you angry at him? And Americans would say, well, he's a smart man. He does smart dealings. Like he's good at what he does. He's really able to tell big lies and really convince people of the most outlandish things. And somehow then, and I think now, we're attracted to that. I think it may have been some of Strang's success. I think it's definitely some of Trump's success.
Yeah, we are definitely very attracted to that. You mentioned that this, because obviously now that the book's out and you're meeting all these Strangophiles wherever you go, I think for a lot of us, this is what you would call maybe a footnote in the period. Do you think that this book will lead us? Is it important for us to remember this is going on? There seems to be, what can we learn from Strang?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump back a little bit, Daniel, and say that I think the other books about Strang had treated him as sort of a footnote to Mormon history or a Midwestern story. One of the good books about him is called Assassination of a Michigan King, right? Yeah. This is it. And I saw him from the start as sort of this lightning rod for all the crazy enthusiasms and movements and a wackiness and apocalyptic nightmares of the mid-19th century. So I saw it from the start as a much more American story. And what can we learn from him? I mean, in some ways, I think Lincoln said you can fool some of the people some of the time, and all the people, some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people. I think that all the people all the time. I think that eventually works out with a guy like Strang, where it's diminishing returns, right? He gets these hundreds of followers, and slowly people realize like this ain't right, this ain't right, this ain't right, and eventually. Enough people on the island were angry with him, ostensibly over I am not making this up, over his order that women on the island had to wear pantaloons. But I think probably about more than that, that this conspiracy to kill him came around.
The Pantaloon Theory. I see, I mean, it's in the book, but you have to talk a little about the Pantaloon.
Well, this is a lampoon, a cartoon from the time that I think shows you people's fear of pantaloons. On the progressive side, and Strang was very progressive about some things, women on the island were wearing pantaloons almost a year before Amelia Bloomer, the famous women's rights activist, began to wear them as an act of rebellion, an act of sort of a code, a symbol of the women's rights movement. On the other hand, there was a power issue. This cartoon will let you see just how, what a threat wearing of these pants that we do not consider very radical now was. This sort of woman who's shown as a boxer and shown bare-chested, obviously, and just shown as like this threat to masculinity, right? But Strang, I think, twisted that around another way. I think he saw it as a uniform, so that as he was losing power, he said, no, everyone will now wear these pantaloons. All women will wear them. And I think in some ways, the pantaloons became a symbol of fealty to Strang. Like if you were loyal to the king, you wore pantaloons, or you insisted that your wife wear pantaloons. And if you were an opponent of the king, you sort of said, no, I'm not wearing pantaloons, and you can't make my wife wear pantaloons. And I think that there is, you know, again, another correlate with what's going on now with masks, you know, how masks have become a symbol of loyalty to President Trump in this very weird way. So I think it was like that. So I think there was much more at stake than just the pantaloons. But eventually, these pantaloons became enough of an issue where this plot to murder Strang went down. And in 1856, he was shot to death, well, shot and beaten, and eventually died back in Burlington. So, and it's probable that the US government and the state of Michigan helped in this murder. The assailants happened to leap onto a US warship, the very same one that invaded the island, right after killing him, and the ship pulled away. And so it's pretty clear that they had some outside help, but it was definitely an inside job.
As long as we're on, as long as we're on sharing screen, we're not sharing anymore. But I wanted to talk about, because I love this book, and I'm so glad we're in the golden age of streaming, because I think this is a story that's almost too big for a film. Would be, but I would take it as a film, you know. But it just feels like a really great streaming film, you know, like multi-episode, complicated, nuanced characters. Have you thought about this? Any deals? And well, who have you thought about? Have you thought about casting it?
Well, I've been asked about who I'd cast, and so if you could put on number 8, Chris. This was my son, Julian, who's 18 and much more media savvy than the old man is at this point. He recommended Jared Leto, which I think is great. And I'm just struck, among other things, if you look at the two men's noses, they look almost exactly the same. Jared Leto almost looks as if he is a descendant of Strang, and they both have those crazy piercing eyes, which was like Strang's trait that everyone talked about. Was he's got these, obviously they both have these kind of close set crazy eyes, and Strang, people talked about how he could bore a hole in you with his eyes, and that was part of his charisma and attraction. Yeah, so that, I guess, in not that Jared Leto or his people have come to me, or really anyone's people, but in the abstract, that seems like a good casting to me.
Yeah, Dave Lurson in The Shepherd cast Daniel Day-Lewis, but I said, good, but I think he officially retired, so he's going to have to come back into circulation.
He may be a little long in the tooth at this point.
Yeah, because he does die. How old is he when he comes to his age?
So he was born 1813, 43, roughly.
Yeah, no, too late. Too late, buddy. You can play his father-in-law or something like that. Before we move on to some questions, I'm always kind of have to pull book recommendations out of people, but not you. You have actually some recommendations that you like to talk about of some books that you love.
Yeah, I mean, I always do this. Like, first of all, can I just say to your listeners, you know, a lot of artists have it bad now. Musicians, my wife's an actress. She actually did the voiceover for the book, the audiobook version, which is so cool, I gotta say. But, and actors have it really bad right now. My wife is watching this with another unemployed actress, because all actors and actresses in Chicago are unemployed right now because all our theaters are shut down. Musicians have it really rough. Authors have it less rough, but there's not a lot of action at bookstores right now, and bookstores have it rough. Boswell has it rough, so please support them. But I always like to do this. I want to plug a couple of books and talk about at least one more. So the first book on the left is a book by one of my colleagues at DePaul, and co-founder of something I'm very near to my heart, that's very near to my heart, is a publication company called Big Shoulders Books. But Michelle Morano is a really, like, a great essayist. And this book, I've read several essays from, in draft at least, to me is like the last sexual taboo. It's writing about unconsecrated passions between people. It's, in other words, infatuations that don't go anywhere, and that's a scary, dangerous place to write about, and Michelle's done a wonderful job. The next book is Avalon by Richard Jones, one of my favorite poets. He runs Poetry East magazine and is great. And for people who are afraid of poetry, I know poets don't like when I say this, but he is a very accessible, which is not to say slight or simple poet. And then the final book, there's a story here. Just before we went on, Chris Lee, who introduced us at the beginning, revealed that he was Bill Lychak, who wrote Cargo Falls, that he was his student at the University of Pittsburgh. Well, I'm so pleased and honored to tell you like a story. Charles Baxter, one of the great fiction writers in America, was one of my teachers, and he's watching tonight, and it made me very nervous because his picture is right underneath mine. He taught Bill and me at the University of Michigan many, many years ago. And so there's this, so I love that one of Bill's grad students, this is a wonderful book, Cargo Falls, but I love that one of Bill's grad students is on this show. So there's sort of like 3 generations of us, even though Charlie's not really a generation above me because I'm an old guy. But so I just love that. And this book is a beautiful, haunting book about some boys who find a gun in a forest. And what that ends up meaning to their adulthood. And I really strongly recommend this. And I also want to say that Charles Baxter has a novel coming out this fall that I can't wait for. It's called The Sun Collective. I hope I'm getting that right, but I think I am. And so I'm anxiously awaiting that. I've already bought a copy, and that would be on my list too.
I know this is a really hard to believe, but we really were just offered an event with Mr. Baxter today. So I'm hoping he says yes, but it was just like, and when I saw him, I'm like, what?
So anyway, well, it's such a thrill. Well, many friends are in the audience. And if I could recommend one more book, if you don't mind, Daniel, because someone connected to that book is in the, I edited a book called The Garcia Boy, and it's by a writer who passed away years ago, and it's a really stunning autobiography by a guy named Raphael Torch. And the book company that I helped, the book entity I helped found at DePaul University is called Big Shoulders Books, and you can get our books for free. But this is really an incredible book about violence, about masculinity. I'm so proud to have been connected to trying to do something for this writer's legacy. I think he died really young, and when he was just really coming into his own as a writer. And so I never knew him. So this isn't like one of my friends. I never knew him, and I'm told, you know, we may or may not have liked each other, but I have such immense respect and like for him as a writer.
I have a few questions. I think we're going to go into questions. So Chuck Stapleton has asked about St. James City on Beaver Island. Is that?
Yeah. So if you go to Beaver Island now, you're not going to see much left of Strang's colony, partly because it was totally ransacked after he was shot. His enemies came to the island and just forced all the hundreds of Mormons who lived there off, took all their possessions, left them in terrible straits, and then ransacked Beaver Island. So there's one building, maybe kind of 1.5, but what's left is the place names are all, not all, but many of them are from Strang. So St. James is St. James Strang. The one, Beaver Island is a very beautiful place, but still in some ways very, not very 21st century. There's like one big paved road, which only goes about halfway down the island. And that's called the King's Highway. And that's what it's called, the King's Highway, because Strang ordered his people to build it. And there are many, many place names on Beaver Island that are Strang's. And so that part of it is super interesting to go to Beaver Island. Plus, I just recommend going to Beaver Island in general. It's really this amazingly beautiful and remote place, a remote feeling place. It's actually not that remote anymore, but it feels remote when you're on it.
Yeah, I was looking it up. It looks like there were ferries from Charlevoix, but they're not running. So I don't know how these people are getting off the. Are they boating there?
Yeah, I imagine they're running because they just did an
Oh,
event like this with people on Beaver Island, and they were saying there was a kind of an influx of tourists. So
oh,
yeah,
okay.
it takes like 2.5 hours to get there from Charlevoix. It's not that far, and you really feel like, wow. And then it just pops up on Lake Michigan. It's so beautiful. I think it's the biggest island on Lake Michigan, and it's
It
just
is. It is.
just this sudden burst of green. It's just great.
We have actually, I had two questions from Christina Ward, and I have no idea if she's going to ask about the cult of Jared Leto or her other question, or maybe both.
Hi, Miles. Well, that was more a comment that Jared Leto, your preferred, has actually been trying to start his own cult. So that might be a
Oh, I
natural.
didn't know that.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
But my question, I'm a huge fan of Gilbert Seldes' The Stammering Century, and curious how influential that might have been. And then also, had Strang come across the infamous Matthias, Robert Matthews, in his kind of travels in that itinerant preaching? And that's my questions.
Yeah. I don't think Strang and Matthias, there's a good book by Paulie Johnson, obviously, about Matthias. I don't think I know, Christina, the book you referred to. Some touchstone books for me on this were The Confidence Man, the Melville book, which really helped me think through this period. And there's another book called The Adversary by Emmanuel Carrere, which is, I think, a great book about trying to figure out whether someone like this, whether there's a there. So it's about a French guy who for years convinced everyone around him that he was a famous researcher for the World Health Organization, including his wife and kids. Just everyone thought that. And then meanwhile, he was just taking people's money and these scams. And then when it was all gonna be revealed, he killed his parents and their dog, and then went home and killed his family. And Carrere, who's just a wonderful nonfiction writer, I think a really great nonfiction writer, sets about trying to figure out if there's anything there but the persona. And I found that to be a really important book. That's a book I go back to time and time again. Charles Baxter also wrote a great book on con men called The Soul Thief, a novel. So I definitely recommend that. Strang surrounded himself with wonderful con men. And one of the delights of writing this book was to research them. This is a guy named George Adams, who was a Shakespearean actor slash charismatic preacher. He would go to a town one day and do Richard III, and then the next day preach the gospel of James J. Strang. This is a very rare illustration of him. And actually, this illustration made Adams so mad that he made world headlines by stopping the guy who the editor who ran this picture, which makes Adams look like the fop that he probably was. He was a notorious drunk, and anyway, he took a horsewhip out and whipped this guy, and in the middle of Boston, and it made headlines really worldwide. He was just quite a character. So,
an earlier subject of yours, Mr. Harvey, Gilbert Bland in the Island of Lost Maps, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about, do you see any overlap between these two characters, like in terms of their motives or just their kind of psychic makeup?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So my first book, The Island of Lost Maps, was about a guy who went around, it's a nonfiction book about a guy who went around the country stealing old maps out of rare book libraries and selling them. And I think maybe that may have been part of the reason that the editor at Little Brown, Ben George, had some interest in me. Yeah, Strang was, Bland was and maybe is definitely a con man. He used a bunch of false identities to get stuff out of people. I think they were both very intelligent men and could have used their intelligence for many good things. But I think there are definitely some comparisons between the two. So yeah, thanks for the question. Hi,
It
Steve.
wasn't really a question. It was just an answer to a question you raised, which is, yes, the ferry to Beaver Island is working. And indeed, that's where I am now listening to the talk.
Ah,
Well, I'm
it's great
glad,
to know.
yeah, I'm glad to know it. Thanks for that, Steve. Yeah, no, I don't know if this is true, Steve. Someone told me the King of Confidence is being sold at the grocery store. I felt like I had really made it on Beaver Island. That the Historical Society is stocking it, which made me happy. But someone told me that it's also at the grocery store. And I just pictured it next to the propane and, you know, the cold cuts. And I was just really happy about that because I know in the summer, especially, how important that grocery store is to the island. So.
We have a question from Sandy Rizzo.
Hi, Sandy.
Let's see
Hold
if I can
on.
get her
Am I
unmuted.
unmuted?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, cool. So hi, Miles. This is
Hi.
awesome. So my question is, you mentioned that Strang had multiple wives and children. And I wondered in any of your research or like if any of them are still out and about living and doing things and seeing your book and, you know, have you gotten any feedback or reaction from people who might have still been
Oh, yeah, so that's a great question. Sandy's an old high school friend, and I see a couple. Jason Harper is on. This is just so nice. Yeah, so I heard the other night I was on a show called Coast to Coast, which is a big AM, you know, Sandy, big AM show, and I heard from someone who claims to be the descendant of Strang's brother. So. That was kind of exciting talking to him. He said, you know, he didn't tell me much new. He said that Strang was, you know, family lore is that Strang was a con artist. So, which I kind of already gathered, but it was great talking to him. So, and I talked to one member of the Strangite Church, an elder in the Strangite Church in Burlington, who's a very nice guy and an author himself. And so that was interesting. I don't know much about their theology, but that was interesting too. So
I want to do a shout out to a question from a text from Meg Jones, who is actually going to be being one of our conversation partners in September for a book that Chris is already over the moon called Over the Moon About, called Out of Mesopotamia by Salar Abdo. She asks you, if Strang had not been murdered by his followers, what do you think his end would have been? Do you think there was some way for him to survive this? Would he have petered out into obscurity? Would he have gone to a bigger platform?
I think there are sort of two money questions with him. One is, did he actually convert to Mormonism? Did he actually believe himself to be a prophet? And so that's one. And the other is like, what could have been? So this was the great age of self-invention in America. I mean, I think it's always, we have a little bit of that, but this was the period where that term self-made man comes in. And I always think about Strang in comparison to Abraham Lincoln, because they had so many things in common. These farm boys from obscure and not connected or wealthy roots, they become country lawyers. They both become postmasters. They both become state reps. For many years of their kind of parallel careers, Strang is the more famous one. But obviously, Lincoln was a force of great good, and I can't say the same about Strang. And so I wonder, could he have used his charisma, his incredible knowledge of the media, which was way ahead of its time, to do more good? I mean, I think he did do some good, you know, like in Michigan, he helped pass what's called a personal liberty law, which is meant to nullify the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and largely did in Michigan. And these laws drove the South crazy. Strang was written about not in a complimentary way in the South, because they effectively stopped or slowed people from returning fugitive slaves to the South. And so I think he did do some good in that way, but I think Strang, you know, did not use his powers of persuasion in a particularly useful way, in my opinion.
Question from Jason Harper.
Hey, Jace. Hey, Janet.
We have Jason Harper's question via text. Miles, can you talk about your research process for a bit? What were your how many miles did you put on your car? How much did you travel? You could talk a little about sources.
So one of the cool things about, it's true of, I think, the Mormon Church and early Mormons in general, but it's definitely true of Strang's group. They saved things. They thought they were bringing about the second coming on Beaver Island, so they saved everything, including Strang's journals. And so there's a great repository of his papers, including many, many letters, etc., at Yale University. And there's another great repository, not quite as extensive, but really good at Central Michigan University. The other thing that was super helpful to me is just this revolution in the digitization of 19th century newspapers in the past, say, 10 years. So some of the discoveries I was making in this basement where I'm talking to you from, in the middle of the night, were just not available to previous researchers. I mean, I think there's just, if you're interested in doing 19th century research, it's a great time because there's just every week more and more papers are getting digitized. And so you can really do some extraordinarily interesting research. So those were some of my sources, yeah.
I think we are probably, I think we've probably hit the moment when I can tell when people are like, I think we've had enough, and you get to the point you're like, you don't want to give the whole book away, but there are so many interesting stories. One of the great things that the New York Times said, there's so many tributaries of stories from this too. So you get completely lost in the book. As I said, Nathaniel Philbrick, Eric Larson, beautiful book, end papers. You don't see that all the time anymore. Very nice. It is available everywhere, including grocery stores and some grocery stores. We love the book. It's 20% off at Boswell. We're so grateful that you could join us tonight. We are, by the way, I just mentioning, he's gone now, so I don't want to embarrass him, but yeah, I'm probably going to do the Charles Baxter event. So like a big pile of Charles Baxter books. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thanks all of you for being part of the Boswell Book audience. We wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you.
Thanks to you, Daniel. Thanks to Chris. Thanks to Boswell. And thanks to all, there's so many people I love in this audience. And it's this kind of thing where I can see everyone's face is a little high pressure, but it's been just great, and love to a lot of people out there. And for people who are interested in more or want to get a hold of me, there's more on my website, which is just www.milesharvey.com. So thank you all.